Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to North America's SAF Scaling Potential, Unlocking SAF Credits and Unpacking the 40B SAF GREET 2024 model. Thank you all for joining us today. My name's Roz. I'm the Event Director for Sustainable Aviation Futures North America Congress. Sustainable Aviation Futures hosts a global series of high-level aviation decarbonisation conferences, bringing together the entire value chain to network, connect, and discuss capabilities for scaling sustainable solutions to reach net zero by 2050. Over the next 60 minutes, our panel of experts will discuss the recently announced updates to the GREET model, including the impacts on feedstock producers' available methods to reduce carbon, how this will affect the margin for SAF credits on established pathways, dive into climate-smart agriculture practices, the exciting inclusion of corn and soybeans, and look at renewable process energy and carbon capture and storage. The webinar is being hosted ahead of Sustainable Aviation Futures North America Congress, which is taking place in Houston from the 2nd to the 4th of October. Today, we'll provide a snapshot into the topics covered at the event, which will include our speakers today, as well as King & Spalding, who are one of our platinum sponsors for the event. The three-day event will feature over 700 senior leaders and industry experts from across the entire aviation and energy value chain to discuss announced SAF projects and exciting offtake agreements in North America, the path to meeting the industry's ambitious targets, as well as the global SAF landscape and innovative low and zero emission technologies. Also coming up in the Sustainable Aviation Futures calendar is the SAF Masterclass, which is an online training course hosted over 3 days, covering in-depth modules on production pathways and feedstock availability, blending, SAF economics, and more. If you'd like to keep abreast of all of our upcoming events, as well as gain access to exclusive interviews and articles, be sure to subscribe to our monthly newsletter, SAF Spotlight. Finally, before I hand over to today's moderator, just a couple of bits of housekeeping. The session is being recorded and will be distributed to you once the webinar finishes. So if you have to drop off for any reason, don't worry, you won't miss out on the insights shared. There is also a Q&A at the bottom of your screen. So please ask any questions you have there. And when we get to the Q&A, we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. With that, I'm pleased to hand over to our brilliant moderator, Peter Zhao, partner at King & Spalding. So Peter, please take it away.
Ross, thank you for your kind words and for sponsoring today's presentation. I'm Peter Zhao. I'm a partner at King & Spalding and the head of our West Coast Environmental Health and Safety Practice, resident here in Los Angeles. I am a long-time energy and environmental lawyer. I've practiced for 39 years, and I'm also a former chemical engineer. So the topic that we have for you today is really going to be interesting and I think informative. With that, let me pass it on to Ken Hill.
Good morning and good afternoon. Thanks, Peter, for that introduction. A little bit, my name is Ken Hill, as I said. I'm a strategy consultant focused on financing and deploying renewable fuels and chemicals projects around the world. I work a lot with global clients, as well as being a contract consultant for the U.S. Department of Energy's Loan Program Office. My background, I'm also a recovering chemical engineer. I spent a lot of years in the industrial chemicals and oil refining industry before moving to renewables industry about 15 years ago. A lot of the last 20 years I've spent focused on regions outside the U.S., working for a large multinational and for a few startups. But since the IRA was passed a year and a half ago, I've shifted my focus back to the U.S. for a lot of projects, including a lot of SAF projects, somewhere in the range of $40 billion in investment. So look forward to contributing today in the discussion around the IRA and specifically the tax credits that might enable the deployment of sustainable aviation fuel. I think on to the next person. I think Veronica.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Hi, I'm Veronica Bradley. I work for Clean Fuels Alliance America, which is a U.S. trade association representing the entire supply chain for biodiesel, renewable diesel, and sustainable aviation fuel. I'm the director of environmental science, so I work on the quantification and communication of the environmental value of our fuels. So that's carbon intensity, emission factors for fuel customers and indirect consumers and the like. And my background is in greenhouse gas accounting and modeling, as well as environmental law and policy. I've been with Clean Fuels for about 2 years now, and most recently came from Airlines for America. So have a little bit of aviation knowledge layered on top of all of that. And I'll pass it to Blake.
Thanks, Veronica. My name is Blake Simmons. Unlike Peter and Ken, I am a practicing chemical engineer. I guess we're all recovering in one way or another. And I am the Division Director of Biological Systems and Engineering at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. I'm also the Chief Science and Technology Officer of the Joint Bioenergy Institute. Also adjunct professor in chemical engineering at UC Berkeley. I've been working in the renewable fuels biomanufacturing system for about 23 years. Have been working primarily around how you convert terrestrial biomass and algae into sustainable biofuels and bioproducts. A recent focus of the Joint Bioenergy Institute is really focused on sustainable aviation fuels, not through the traditional routes that have been approved that we'll be talking about here in a little bit, but really going into higher energy density molecules that can enable performance and maintain the low carbon intensity that we're all striving for in this enterprise. I'm really looking forward to talking about the 40B shift here and opportunity, and delighted to be here with you all today. And Peter, I will turn it back to you.
Thank you, Blake. So as many of you in the audience know, the Inflation Reduction Act is the largest commitment to climate change legislation ever in the history of the United States, and probably or certainly in the history of the world. And the ambition for sustainable aviation fuels is to reduce carbon emissions from aviation fuel by 50% or more, and to add on to the ambition to generate 3 billion gallons of sustainable aviation fuel every year, starting in the foreseeable future. We'll see whether we get there or not. Today's panel, as you can tell, are experts in this field. And while some of you may be quite sophisticated, some of you may be just starting your interest in this topic. And so for that reason, we're going to start with setting the table. Roz, can you help me with the slide? And there it is. So we're going to talk a little bit about this very complicated way we describe this topic, about unpacking. What is Section 40B? What are these tax credits? And why is this going to be important, not just to SAF, but to you? So to do that, I'm going to turn it over to Ken. Ken, why don't you set the table for us?
Sure. Thanks, Peter. It's important to understand, as Peter said, there are a lot of mechanisms within the Inflation Reduction Act that are designed to incentivize the production of sustainable aviation fuel. You may be aware of the various different tax credit numbers and alphabet soup, if you will. Things like 45Q on carbon capture and storage, 45V on clean hydrogen, 45Z, which I think Blake will talk about a little bit later on, the clean fuel production tax credit, and 45C, advanced energy project credit. But what we're going to focus on today is the 40B tax credit. The key thing to know about the 40B tax credit is that it is designed to go from the 2023 up until the end of this year, and it's designed to be a tax credit of $1.25 per gallon for sustainable aviation fuel blended with a 50% or greater reduction in GHG. There are bonus points for that. If for every 1 percentage point less than 50% or more than 50%, you get an extra penny per gallon up to another 50 cents. So a total of $1.75 per gallon. It is important to know that that does expire at the end of this year, when the idea is that transitions to the 45Z clean fuel production tax credit at that point at the beginning of 2025. So the key thing to understand, we'll talk a little bit more about today, are the qualifications for that, and how do you actually calculate the greenhouse gas reduction compared to Jet A fuel based from fossil fuel, and then how can you then claim that for the tax credit. It's also important to know that the 40B tax credit, in contrast to a lot of the other tax credits in the IRA, is not transferable or tradable. whereas 45Z, 45Q, these are tradable. You can do things like tax equity financing and sell those tax credits. 40B, you cannot. So the other thing I do want to mention in the tax in the IRA that's important for sustainable aviation fuel is there are a lot of other things besides tax credits. We tend to focus a lot on the tax credits, but there are a lot of things other than tax credits included in the IRA. Things like loans for financing from the division I support in DOE called the Loan Programs Office, where there's about $300 billion in financing. There are grants from various different offices within the Department of Transportation and Department of Energy, amounting to billions and millions and billions, depending on what type. And there are other tax credits as well. There are state level tax credits that are continuing to expand, and things like low carbon fuel standard and renewable fuel standard, which also carbon credits that can account toward sustainable aviation fuel production and try to enable that deployment. So, but today we're going to focus on the 40B SAF GREET model, the guidance that recently came out with from Treasury at the end of April, and how that can be utilized to apply for and receive those tax credits.
Veronica, tell us more, setting the table. What's something that our audience should know if they're just dipping their toe into this area?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have too much more to add than what Ken said. I think he gave a very good landscape situation. I think two things to note. One, I would underscore Ken's point that this tax credit is for last year and this year. And so at the end of this year, we would shift to that producer tax credit, that 45Z tax credit. So that, kind of tightens the window of opportunity of taking advantage of the tax credit. And I think that the second thing, which I can get into, I think a little bit more later, is that the SAF, the 40B SAF GREET model is one methodological option for calculating that carbon intensity, that percent reduction beyond 50% compared to petroleum jet fuel to calculate the final value of the tax credit.
Thank you, Veronica. Blake, would you like to add to this?
Yeah, not a lot, but just a few points of distinction that I think are really important for everyone to understand is that while the floor of the tax credit under 40B is $1.25, if you hit the 50% greenhouse gas emission reductions relative to the petroleum baseline, and I'm an engineer, so I love numbers, it's 89 grams of carbon dioxide per equivalent per megajoule of energy you generate. For petroleum, that's kind of the baseline comparison. So you have to be 50% better than that. And then there's actually an extra kicker. For every percent you go above that reduction, you can get an increase up to a maximum of $1.75 if you're 100% better than petroleum. But just to put it, that's the $1.25 to $1.75 credit that you can obtain from the 40B. The other important thing, and it is rather bold and ambitious from the policy landscape, is that this 40B really also, I should includes the USDA climate smart agricultural emphasis on land management practices and accreditation of those land management practices that go into the accreditation of the pathway. As most folks know, there are 7 pathways for sustainable aviation fuels that are approved and are included in kind of the GREET baseline model. The 2 feedstocks that are of interest here are pretty much corn and soybean. So it's really limiting the range of the agricultural producers and growers and shippers into a very narrow bin. But the fact that we are now talking about climate smart agriculture as part of a broader system of analysis and system of systems that go into greenhouse gas emission reduction programs and calculations is really impactful. And something that I personally hope, and I'm not speaking on behalf of DOE or anybody else, just me, it's something that I hope that will be maintained as we go into the transition from 40B to 45Z. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Peter.
All right, Blake, I have a question for you. If I'm a producer of biofuels, why should I bother to make sustainable aviation fuel? Why don't I just make biodiesel or just inject my ethanol into regular blended gasoline?
That is the question. And I think a lot of producers are actually asking themselves that same question. There are a lot of producers that are balancing between renewable diesel conventional alcohol and alcohol to jet. Most of the HEFA producers are really slated into the sustainable aviation fuel market from the very beginning. And so I think there's this balance of trade and risk mitigation assessments and cost benefit analysis that need to go into whether you're going to go into the SAF market or to another renewable fuel market. I will say that the added tax credit of $1.25 to $1.75 is rather significant. If you can tie that into a CCS program, you can tie that into a sustainable ag program and get into horizontal integration along one conversion technology that is really relegated for a particular feedstock of interest. And let's say you have a 10 or 15-year agreement from the producers to you, from those smart ag producers, it might be very much in your economic interest to any business model to pivot to a sustainable aviation fuel marketplace play. I think the real question here is the permanence of the 40B within the 45Z. I always go to Z pronunciation. To really make a long-term decrease in the risk of the investment of any new capital infrastructure you would need to make to transfer and pivot to a SAF producer. So I think every business model is going to be unique. Every CEO is going to be needing to have conversations with their tax accountants to make sure they're doing the right calculations. And they're going to need to be really, really, really familiar with the GREET model and the provisions in the tax code from the IRA. So it's a very complex landscape. And I think it can be very fruitful for some, but probably won't be beneficial to all, at least in the short term.
And for everyone,
and not to split hairs, but I would say you gave the example of biodiesel, but a biodiesel producer cannot produce SAF, right?
Right. Exactly.
It's different technology. So renewable diesel can upgrade potentially with some capital investment to SAF, but a biodiesel producer cannot. So there is going to be an infrastructure need, right?
Yes, if I misspoke, it was renewable diesel, not biodiesel that I was talking about. So yeah, and there are some hydrothermal technologies that you could pivot. That could be some dynamic interplay between whether you go to renewable diesel or SAF, but those are very limited out there in the marketplace currently.
And adding to Blake, be sure also to consult with your environmental and tax lawyers as well when you're.
Yeah.
All right. With that, let's Roz, if you show my next chapter slide, please. The next topic we're going to talk about is to take a closer look at the modeling, which is going to be very important in order to understand whether or not you qualify for the credit and how to piece your way through these IRS regulations. So Veronica, why don't you start here? Why don't you start with an explanation of what is a life cycle analysis of a fuel, and then talk about the methodologies.
Yeah, sure. There's a few ways to do life cycle analysis for a fuel, but traditionally in U.S. policy context, you look at the supply chain emissions or attributional emissions associated with each step in the supply chain, the growing or gathering of the feedstock, the other process energy inputs and the like, the transportation, the production of the fuel itself, distribution, through to combustion. And then there's kind of a separate piece that most of our policies add to that, which is true for sustainable aviation fuel, whether that's under California LCFS or internationally under CORSIA eligible fuels as part of the CORSIA program, or for these tax credits, which is kind of these indirect emissions or induced emissions, and in particular land use change emissions, but can dive in a minute on how there are other indirect emissions also associated in the 40B SAF GREET model. But so that's generally how you approach life cycle assessment and making these carbon intensity scores that you then compare to those same steps, those same emitting processes associated with petroleum fuel. But to get into kind of the calculation of that % reduction for 40B, it was said a couple of times, very simple, straightforward, if you will, how to calculate the actual tax credit value, but then calculating the carbon intensity is a little more murky. So the 40B statutory language said to calculate the carbon intensity, you can use one of two methodologies. The quote CORSIA methodology, which, for CORSIA eligible fuels amount to either default values that have been created in the CORSIA program that you can find kind of on ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization's website, or actual life cycle emissions calculations, which kind of flow through sustainability certification schemes and certification bodies. And it ends up basically today with getting a CI score either from the Roundtable on Sustainable Biomaterials or RSB or ISCC and their methodologies. RSB uses EcoInvent kind of based tool for those who know life cycle accounting, and ISCC doesn't really have one specific model, but GREET is one of the options of models that ISCC would certify a fuel's carbon intensity to. So you kind of go through under the CORSIA methodology, that whole CORSIA eligible fuel certification process to get that value. The other option in the statute was, quote, a similar methodology that satisfies the criteria of the Clean Air Act's Renewable Fuel Standards Life Cycle Emissions definition. And so back in December, Treasury released its kind of first guidance related to this, quote, similar methodology and what that would entail. They clarified that the GREET model as published as of that year was not by itself sufficient to satisfy the renewable fuel standard criteria. And to get slightly in the weeds on that, it's essentially, it comes down to some of these other indirect emissions categories aside from land use change, but are related to agriculture and livestock, and so really apply to those agricultural feedstocks. But in that December guidance, Treasury said, okay, well, we're going to work with our federal agency partners to modify the GREET model so that we have a similar methodology based on GREET, but accommodating that kind of legal requirement to satisfy the criteria of the Clean Air Act. And then also in December, the Treasury Department said, in the meantime as well, we'll have this safe harbor that directly relates to EPA's renewable fuel standard. And so if you use EPA's quality assurance program and you already have satisfied the 50% reduction based on being an advanced biofuel, you can get that minimum $1.25 credit. So you've already proved through EPA's program that you meet 50%, so you get 50% reduction, you get $1.25. So that kind of was a safe harbor for various pathways that didn't really at least from a broad perspective, compared to what the CORSIA methodology provided in their kind of default values, kind of allowed for HEFA pathways that had agricultural feedstocks, and then brought in some really specific projects, I think in the US, like LanzaJet's facility in Georgia, as well as kind of camelina as a feedstock by itself, and Carinata pathway that was facility specific to Chevron REG. And then the big piece that, just a month ago, which is crazy, it's only been a month, considering how much you've been paying attention to it. Treasury went into the 40B SAF GREET model that was released on April 30th. And so kind of outside that CORSIA program, outside that RFS safe harbor, you can use kind of user-specific data to calculate through the GREET model reduction or your carbon intensity score. A few notable things about this: it provides some different kind of carbon intensity reduction opportunities related to some of those technologies that Ken mentioned up front, whether it's carbon capture sequestration, green hydrogen, some landfill renewable natural gas pathways, as well as renewable electricity inputs. And then, as Blake mentioned, the kind of first opportunity that we've seen in any carbon intensity biofuel programs in the US, an opportunity to reduce kind of the feedstock associated emissions from agricultural feedstocks, and specifically corn and soy, based on different farming practices for corn using no-till cover crop and enhanced efficiency fertilizers can get you a 10-gram reduction And for soy, using no-till and cover crops, fertilizer is not really an opportunity for reductions for soy because you just don't really use them. And that can get you a 5-gram CI reduction. And then the last piece, I know this is probably really heavy and dense for the audience, but the last piece I really wanted to highlight was that that difference between kind of what we see in a lot of CI-based programs, otherwise that ILUC value that is kind of tacked on for agricultural-based fuels is actually more than just more than just ILUC for 40B SAF GREET. So as I mentioned, a couple of other emissions categories that are included in that indirect emissions value, but ultimately kind of the baseline inputs into the GREET, taking kind of national average information, all of those kind of quote that quote penalty for indirect emissions for soy or canola or corn or Brazilian sugarcane are all really actually lower in the SAF GREET model than the CORSIA values that have been most recently published. So that's just kind of an interesting point of reference when considering the opportunities of which methodology makes the most sense for calculating that CI score. And I'll leave it there.
Veronica, since you have the microphone and you've taken us through this incredibly dense set of modeling, why don't you look into your crystal ball and tell us about yet another model, which is the upcoming GREET 45Z model. What do you see coming out of that?
Yeah, well, I think we're hopeful when it comes to agricultural feedstocks, which maybe I think Blake mentioned his interest in this too, is being able to capture more feedstock opportunities, more agricultural feedstocks than simply the handful that was included in 40B SAF GREET. I think also more opportunities for other land management practices beyond the few that I mentioned related to corn and soy to see carbon intensity reductions from those crops, as well as practices that make better sense for different regions. This is, I think, a very quick and dirty way, knowing the timing of the tax credit, to get kind of a wedge in there for the opportunity. And I think I am very hopeful that we'll see something a little more robust that allows the differentiation of the climate in the U.S. to create feedstocks and the best way to reduce them. I think also I'd really like to see some less restrictive language around some of the other carbon intensity reduction opportunities. In particular, the one that stood out to me was related to RNG. So you only can have landfill renewable natural gas, not any other feedstock source. It has to be directly connected to the facility rather than being able to be piped in. And it has to have no other productive use at the time that you start to use it, which I think opens up a whole can of worms on how you qualify that, and may not make the most sense to being the most efficient way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for the economy generally.
Thank you, Veronica. Ken, do you have some comments about this?
Yeah, and to looking forward for the 45Z as we transition to that, as Veronica said, I think hopefully we're going to be able to be building on what we are doing here with 40B and being able to expand that as we get to the next step. Because we're looking at multiple pathways, I think, to get to sustainable aviation fuel, not just the 7 that are currently in the 40B GREET model, which are mostly based upon HEFA-based technology and alcohol to jet only, because the projects I'm seeing are including gasification, pyrolysis, as well as e-fuels in various different shapes and forms, are also going to be needed to meet that 3 billion gallon target in 2030 that you mentioned, Peter, and 36 billion in 2050, which is a pretty big number. So I think that hopefully this is a first step, and maybe it gets tweaked a little bit. Again, my perspective, not necessarily anybody else's. It gets tweaked a little bit. Maybe we can optimize and expand that as we look at the other feedstocks. I will also mention, though, that for those who want to dig into some of the weeds that Veronica was talking about, The DOE does have a guideline, kind of a guidebook on how the 40B GREET model works. The Office of Energy Efficiency and has a really good guideline there to kind of explain that well-to-wheel LCA analysis, the pathways that are included, and even some of the calculations that you need to do. So I encourage you, if you want to get into that, go into the website and be able to see that.
Blake, would you like to comment? And will the genies at Treasury grant the wishes of Veronica and Ken and give us this new and improved 45Z GREET model?
We'll talk about that when we get to that point. I wanted to also add some complexity into the methodologies here, just to kind of correlate the linkages between the USDA, DOE, and Treasury, because they had to deal with a very complex landscape of different stakeholders and different audiences that they had to satisfy. And then, of course, you have President Biden's, trying to solve the climate challenge mission from OSTP on down. But they really created a constrained methodology to qualify for the 40B credit that links ag and conversion in a very unique way. And the Climate Smart Ag program, it's a pilot program at USDA, actually. And so if you want to be, as Veronica said, there are very specific agricultural practices that you need to maintain. And then on top of that, if you want to qualify for the CSA reduction as a SAF producer, you have to obtain unrelated party certification. And I'm reading from the code here directly because it's very complex and Byzantine even for me. But it's you have to get unrelated party certification of compliance with the practice requirements that Veronica mentioned above. The certifier must audit records on a regular basis. The registered SAF producers must contract directly with the USDA Climate Smart Ag pilot program farmers and collect and maintain certificates for each CSA crop, maintain all required records, and make them available to the certifier and the IRS at any time on demand. And they also have to submit the CSA certification and certificates for the Climate Smart Ag crops with their claims. So this is a very specific policy that is selecting down to very few growers and converters already. And they have a very meticulous policy perspective and enforcement mechanism, primarily because of the lessons learned from other big biofuel initiatives across the world that didn't have a certification, didn't have an audit trail, and you really had, carbon forensics that led to some marketplace, impact, but didn't move the needle in the way expected on the climate and environmental side. And so I think you're seeing a much more deliberate, mindful, and intentional approach to these policy mechanisms. I'm sure we're going to see this when we roll off of the 40B into whatever comes next. But like what Veronica and Ken were saying, the hope is that we can expand the net of acceptable pathways, not only on the conversion side, but on the Climate Smart Ag and an expansion of the Climate Smart Ag pilot program, as well as coupling that to things like carbon capture, sequestration, renewable natural gas, renewable electrons, having more of an impact on the CI, perhaps, than is currently in place for the 40B policy. So it's a very specific provision, but it does set a great precedent for what could come next in really opening up the taps, literally, for increased production of the SAF types that we want and not allowing those that we don't.
Thank you, Blake. Roz, why don't you go? Oh, go ahead, Ken, please.
Yeah, so maybe Blake, also, and isn't there some sort of synergy between the low carbon fuel standard certification and the 40B GREET? Now that since you're in California, maybe you can speak to that.
Well, currently the accreditation process that they're having for the Climate Smart Ag isn't included in the low carbon fuel standard. I think that that's an opportunity for the low carbon fuel standard to improve itself. It's got its own problems right now in that it's pretty much an all-time low in the pricing of the carbon credits. I think when I last looked, it was $50 a ton, and that's down from 200 at the peak. And so we're having a lot of access and use of the low carbon fuel standard that's really flooding the market in a good way and issuing carbon credits, but it's creating a tenuous risk around investment in new technologies to take advantage of both the 40B, 45Z, and the LCFS. And so that's going to be a market and policy dynamic that's going to be very interesting to see play out.
Thank you, everyone. Roz, why don't you put up our next chapter heading? We've talked a little bit about climate smart agriculture. Let's talk about climate and tax smart ways to approach these various tax credits. Sorry, Roz, one slide before that. And to try to understand where are we with the clock running out on the tax credits under Section 40B, and how are we going to transition to the new existing or continuing tax credits under 45Z. So Blake, walk us through this and make our audience tax smart as well as climate smart.
Well, that's a pretty big challenge. I will do my best and endeavor to do so. But it's interesting that you're saying the clock's already running out when we're less than a month into this. So the clock's really running really fast, and it will be interesting to see who, if anyone, can really take advantage of the 40B tax credit in a significant way. I think that will be a tell for what will come next as well when we get into the transition. But I want to take a step back and go over some of the key features of the 45Z tax credit, just to make sure we're operating from the same baseline. In terms of eligibility, it's available for producers of clean fuels, including sustainable aviation fuel, biodiesel, renewable diesel, and other qualifying fuels. Again, they have to meet that specific greenhouse gas emission reduction threshold compared to petroleum-based fuels. Unlike the 40B, the 45Z starts at a 20 cent per gallon credit for most eligible fuels. Sustainable aviation fuel can qualify for a higher base credit of $1.75. And additional incentives can increase the credit amount potentially up to another $1 per gallon for fuels with greater greenhouse gas emission reductions. And there is another bonus credit of $1.25 per gallon that's available for sustainable aviation fuel, meeting stricter emissions criteria. The duration here, since we're already talking about the clock, the credit will be available for fuels produced and sold from January 1st, 2025 to December 31st, 2027. The tax credit can be used in conjunction with other federal and state incentives, potentially increasing the overall financial benefit for clean fuel producers. And if it includes climate smart ag, the feedstock producers. In terms of certification and verification, producers must obtain certification and verification of their fuels to qualify for the credit, but it's not currently as rigorous, other than the things that we already talked to with Veronica on the accreditation on the carbon intensity and the greenhouse gas emission reductions. And so open questions are, when we get to the end of this year and going into 2025, what will be that transition from 40B to 45Z? And that is a really good question that I wish I had a crystal ball for. I think what you will see, certainly the floor is set for 45Z. That's been in place by the announcement by everyone. But I think you're going to see a lot of push for amendments to include certain aspects of 40B, most notably the climate smart ag. I think you're also going to try and see an expansion of the feedstocks that can qualify for both under the 40B auspices and transition to the broader scope of 45Z. Veronica, sorry, you have your hand raised. I'll get to you real quick. But, I think it's not going to be a seamless transition. And my prediction is that you'll probably see iterative improvements over that time frame and policy adjustments in the tax credit for 45Z. I think you're going to see a refinement in the models that go into the life cycle assessment / analysis. And I think that's going to be driven by a lot of key stakeholder engagement as we navigate through this transition. And I think there's going to be a lot of lawyers involved in this as well, in taking cases before every cognizant governing body and decision-making authority. And you're already seeing a lot of the NGOs and how should I say, more principled stakeholders trying to really rig that transition in their favor. And it will be very interesting to see how that all plays out. So my best at the crystal ball. I'll turn it over to Veronica. She had her hand up.
Yeah. Veronica, you're not going to put up with that, are you? That was just, yeah.
Well, I did want to clarify though, because I think Blake, you suggested that the calculation is based off of a % reduction, and it's actually yes and no. So
yes
this is a bit
yeah.
different. So rather than the kind of % reduction being a calculation relative to a petroleum baseline, this is actually a tax credit that's available for fuels that have carbon intensities lower than 50 kilograms CO2 equivalent per MMBTU. So then that is the threshold from which you are calculating your carbon intensity reduction. And there are two also kind of qualifications to where that percent reduction then is. $1.75 for SAF is the ceiling, really.
Yes.
And then and I think there is some debate amongst the legal, as a recovering lawyer, the legal minds of whether if you have a negative CI fuel, whether you can go above $1.75. But the base value being $1.75, and for that kind of net zero fuel, and then for kind of non-net zero fuels going higher than that, you would be taking a kind of a discount off of that. So it's just a different way of calculation, which I think does also add a bit to the confusion of what all of this will be translated into, beyond kind of the opportunities to massage the methodology for kind of an expansion for different opportunities for feedstocks and lowering CI and different technologies and all of that.
And I'll add that one key thing that I mentioned earlier around the 45Z compared to the 40B is that it is transferable. So it's bankable to the point where you can, from a financing perspective, you can sell those credits and be able to finance your projects. A lot of developers, a lot of small companies may not be able to use those offsets because they may not have much of a tax bill. So being able to transfer those really opens up a lot of opportunity from a financing and a revenue standpoint. The other big elephant in the room, of course, is, as Blake mentioned, is that the 45Z expires at the end of 2027. So only another 2 years, 3 years. And so the big question is what happens next after that even? And what I will say is that you're starting to hear rumblings, and these are in the press, on a bipartisan basis of extending the 45Z past 2027, which as any developers or people trying to look at SAF projects would be a big deal. And so hopefully maybe they actually do that and do it soon, so that it sends a good signal to those folks looking to invest in projects for SAF production, so that they can actually be able to get even more for those projects. Blake.
I was just going to say real quick, sorry, Blake, that the fact that like all of the other IRA tax credits that are similarly situated were like for 10 years, and this was only for a combined total of 5 is a bit, I mean, that in and of itself, I feel like it's a good reason to extend it.
Right.
But sorry, Blake.
No, I was gonna highlight that out. I was also going to point out the reality of building new capital projects on the ground and getting them commissioned by 2027. If it's a brownfield, or even if it's a greenfield site, getting it up and running and producing at that level that you need it to justify the financing, it's going to extend your off ramp way past 2027. So, and there's a lot of calculations in the heavy cap market and liquidity about whether it's worth the risk to build something that massive that may not realize its payoff from the policy perspective. So I do agree that it would be great to see it go for 10 years. If you talk to some of the producers, they would want more than that, but I think that would be a good start, especially when you're talking about the size and the volume we're talking about. I mean, the volumes are staggering. And if you take a look at the corn ethanol example, whether you like that one or not, it went up, very rapidly to 10 to, in a good day, 11.8 billion gallons a year. And that was a massive influx of capital and a massive influx in production. And to try and triple that for the SAF market by the timeline is going to be a really big lift. And one of the ways that you can really undercut it is by really increasing the risk and uncertainty in the financing of it and the risk acquisition perspective of it. So these are really important issues.
Blake, let's take a little bit of time and talk about climate smart agricultural practices. Maybe you could describe what some of those are, and about the all or nothing requirement, which has come under some criticism.
Well, so you have to start somewhere, right? And Veronica highlighted these already. And so if you're doing corn, you have to have no-till agriculture, cover crops, and low carbon fertilizers. And it has to be all three. And that's through that Climate Smart Ag pilot program to the USDA certification process. So those growers are already in the pilot program for the most part and are already adhering to the certification process around that. For soybean, you have to do 2 out of the 3. It's got to be no-till practices and low carbon fertilizers for the additional carbon intensity score reduction. There's a lot of debate in the CDR MRV community about how, robust these audit practices are and how you're actually going to be measuring these over time and who's going to be signing on to the risk if someone gets caught, doing things out of compliance, shall we say. And then if you look to expand that and get into other agricultural sectors or even forestry sectors, like to me, a great feedstock that you could point to is wood that is harvested from wildfire risk reduction programs that are occurring throughout the world for a healthy forest program, and then converting that into a sustainable aviation fuel, for example. Mm-hmm. If you were to embark on that thought exercise, what would that carbon intensity reduction look like? Because literally that carbon goes up in smoke if you don't do this land management practice and convert it into something in a controlled combustion environment. And so I know that CAL FIRE and CARB already having conversations along that path. I think, it's still too premature for a national conversation about that currently, but I think the inclusion of climate smart ag into 40B and hopefully moving into 45Z is the first step along that journey. Because I think that's a conversation, a policy discussion that we need to have sooner rather than later.
And I would add that I think you referenced MRV, and I think one thing that's important to keep in mind in all of this is that the carbon intensity value is not an emission factor for your fuel. So you can do things like credit, wildfire, mitigation, forestry differently than commercial trimmings or something like that. And I think that that's really important to keep in mind because one of the things that I found a little frustrating with the qualification program under the pilot program was the language that was very restrictive on the opportunities for farmers to participate in this program because they shouldn't be participating in any other program because we're very worried about double counting because of offsetting, because of additionality. And that's just fundamentally different situation than carbon intensity calculations and carbon intensity evaluation. And so, it's one thing if a farmer is participating in an offset program, that's a conversation. Maybe then you can't attribute the benefit in a carbon intensity score, but certainly, for the value that we're getting from the tax credit, from the values that are potential for other carbon intensity programs, that I think the fuel producer and the farmer are really going to need that additive stackability to actually move the needle and use biofuels as a way to reduce agricultural emissions too.
So Ken, I'm going to give you last word. Counterparties are already having to enter into their fuel supply contracts for next year. And so what do you think? As you look out there over the regulated community, does 40B have a heartbeat? And is it loud enough that you could hear it?
Well, as I think what Blake mentioned earlier, there really likely to be very few people who are able to claim the 40B GREET tax credit this year. And if you're not already producing, you're not going to be there. Maybe if you're producing a little bit toward the end of the year. I know there's one project that's coming online at the end of the year. Maybe they'll get a few months of tax credits, but basically, if you're already not producing and you're not about to be producing, you're not going to get much benefit. The big thing is, though, as we say, extending the 45Z is really, and being able to plan to that, even if you're looking at building something today. And if you haven't broken ground today, I mean, it's 2024, it takes 3 to 4 years to build a project of this size, because a lot of these SAF projects, whether they're alcohol to jet or HEFA or gasification or any of the others, they're $1 billion+ projects. So they don't go up quickly. And so in order to be able to account the 45Z tax credit, that will need to be extended so that people can get some certainty. I even have some banker friends who actually already believe that it's going to be extended, and they're banking on that. So it's a little risky from my perspective, but I think that you're starting to see the rumblings there, and it is impacting the investment community as they look at financing these SAF projects, no matter which pathway they're looking to take. I will just add to Blake and Veronica's comments around the additional pathways. Those are going to be so critical, I think, to be able to get to where we need to be, because we're trying to take that all of the above strategy. In comparison to other parts of the world, in particular Europe, was trying to pick some specific technologies, and we're trying to really focus on the GHG reduction. And as long as you can do that and demonstrate that with data, then we don't care what technology it is. And so I think that's a big positive. It's just a matter of making sure we get that calculation right and reasonable and practical so that people can actually depend on it.
Rosalind, why don't you show us our last slide, chapter heading? And the question that I have for our panelists is, tell the audience, what is the next big thing that's going to happen? And what is that obstacle to, the next big obstacle to overcome? So Veronica, why don't we start with you?
I was afraid you were going to say that. I mean, I think what our conversation highlighted very well, kind of the obstacle that we have to overcome, which is kind of having a solid methodology as a foundation that can be relied upon for a multitude of programs. And hopefully, as these tax credits get extended, it's driving the right reductions where they are. I mean, I think the next big thing is really figuring out these technologies, expanding the infrastructure and building all of this supply chain up to really support the deployment of these fuels across the country and the world.
So Veronica, I'll put you on the spot. With your ear to the ground, what do you hear about the influence or the effect of our congressional and presidential election on the extension of these SAF initiatives?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really huge question mark. I know my very personal take is like, when you have such a polarized system around the topic of climate change, I fear that if the election goes one way, all of this work that we've been doing will kind of just go get put on a shelf somewhere, and just the optics of supporting the Inflation Reduction Act or just supporting anything that could help decarbonize will not come to fruition. But I mean, for our sector, I mean, we have a history of continuing to push for bipartisan work and support, and we've had tax credits, biodiesel tax credits expire and come back and expire and come back, and it is really hard for the industry. But at the same point, I think it shows the strength of bringing together kind of the whole country to support decarbonization. And so I mean, I'm hopeful that we won't have that turmoil, because we'll at least have kind of the balance of our branches of government to force things to continue. But it will. I am very concerned that it slows down the progress. And of course, mitigating greenhouse gas emissions today is more important than mitigating them tomorrow because of the global warming effect. So yeah, I guess I'll leave it there.
Blake, why don't you comment on that, and also tell us what you think. What is the next big thing and the obstacle that we need to overcome?
Well, I think to me, the next big thing is non-food feedstocks going into sustainable aviation fuels and other biofuels and bioproducts. I think the EJ community and some key stakeholders, the food versus fuel debate, so-called, needs to turn into a food and fuel solution. And I think there's also the potential for really going after high-risk ecosystems like forests that catch on fire on a more regular basis. And getting our hands around an integrated carbon perspective to drive solutions to the marketplace. And I think you're seeing that already with some of the industry leaders, that they're taking an eye into integrated carbon management technology deployment, like integrating carbon capture and sequestration from your fermenter and doing something with that. But I think to me, the biggest challenge is, how do you take these big 800-pound gorilla projects like the hydrogen hubs, the direct air capture hubs, all the emphasis on carbon capture sequestration and then sustainable aviation fuels and renewable electrons. There aren't a lot of discussions about how you could create a policy environment and tax credit system that leverages and connects all of those in a logical way that really is a force multiplier from reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And to me, I think that's one thing that we need to get after. And I'm not going to touch the politics one. I'll turn that over to Ken.
I would say, just as I keep interjecting, but
no, I'm glad you are.
just a comment on the whole non-food feedstock thing. I think that there's something that's like missed there, that providing additional source of revenue for farmers through agricultural feedstocks is certainly a benefit to the whole food agricultural system, and that really it's complementary and not competition. And I think that the simplistic narrative around it, I think, makes it seem like it's an either or option. But really, like, even the history of soy biodiesel is such that soy oil was being dumped into landfills because it didn't have any value and was suppressing the price of soybeans, right, and making it hard for farmers. And so having soy oil become a feedstock for biodiesel was a benefit to the whole system. And so I think, certainly it's complicated to get it right, but I do think that the narrative about food versus fuel, I think, is kind of a false one.
But that wasn't what I was saying. That wasn't what I was saying, Veronica. Yeah. What I was saying is that the EJ community is saying that.
Yeah,
so first and foremost, that's them, not me. And secondly, to me, it's not an either or proposition. It is it's a food and fuel discussion. And my farm, I'm from Nebraska originally. My whole family are corn growers. So I'm talking about integrated land management practices that you maximize the carbon benefit for every acre. And so to me, it's not an either or, it's an and. The question is, how do you integrate it and maximize the deployment and impact in the marketplace?
Yeah, I didn't mean to suggest that was your opinion. I just wanted to clarify that there's, the debate is a hot one, obviously.
I think both of you need to lawyer up, but let's, why don't I give you a comment? And Ross, if you're out there, then after Ken completes his comments, why don't you take us out?
Yeah, I'll just be very brief, since I know we're running up toward the top of the hour here. I think one of the key things to realize is that where we're headed, and I agree with Veronica, staying the course is going to be something that's important. But what I'm seeing is that this is something that's bigger than just the agricultural environment. When you typically think about the Midwest and in particular, what I'm seeing is SAF projects across the country. We're talking the Gulf Coast, we're talking the Northeast, we're talking the Pacific Northwest, as well as the Midwest. And so when it comes to some of the policies and its longevity, I think that bodes well, because when you see projects across the country in former pulp and paper communities, in energy communities, in agriculture communities, people can see there's a benefit for everybody. And so I'm a little bit optimistic from that perspective, in that we will be able to stay the course and actually keep plowing ahead. So I'll just leave it at that, since we're running pretty tight on time.
Hello, everybody. And yeah, a huge thank you to our brilliant panel for what was a really, really interesting, informative and lively conversation. And thank you to all of our attendees as well. I know there were a lot of questions that we didn't get to, and as is always the way with knowledge expansion and new learnings, I'm sure more questions have come out of the answers that you got during the conversation as well. But if anyone who's attending would like to learn more about what's been discussed today, do make sure to join us in Houston on October 2nd to 4th, for the Sustainable Aviation Futures North America Congress, and go to www.sustainableaviationfutures.com for full details of all of our events, our training courses, and SAF Spotlight. So thank you all again. Thank you to the attendees, and I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your day.